So I am Marcia Ferranto. I am the CEO of the National Law Enforcement Memorial and Museum, and I welcome all of you here this evening. We are presenting tonight, Rising in the Ranks, a part of our Witness series. This would not be possible if it wasn't for the commitment of Target. And today we have Isaac Reyes here with us from Target, as well as Mahogany Ellers. Welcome. Target was a sponsor of ours last year in 2019 and believed so much in what we were doing here. They came back for 2020 equally as committed to the programs that are supporting law enforcement. I thank you for your commitment. I thank Target for their focus on law enforcement, and we will not fail you. So thank you. I would also like to recognize our Board of Directors Chair, Karen Tandy, is in the audience. Karen. I believe we have two board members here tonight. Dwayne Crawford, are you in the house? Dwayne. And Sonia Pruitt is also here. Over here, Sonia. Again, it is the commitment of these volunteers that help us continue to honor the fallen and educate the public on important law enforcement topics. So I would like to introduce to you our moderator and our speaker for this evening, a friend of the museum, and after tonight, a friend of mine. The son of Sheriff Lucius Anderson. Anthony Amerson, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Marcia. It is indeed my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight as we celebrate the accomplishments of African American leaders in law enforcement. My name is Anthony Amerson, and I'm proud to say that I am the son of Lucius Anderson, the first African American sheriff elected in the South since Reconstruction. My brother Peter is in attendance to represent the family. With myself, we'd like to take opportunity to share just a small glimpse of what it was like to be a black sheriff in the South in the 1960s. I ask that we all stand for a moment of silence for all officials in law enforcement that have passed in the line of duty. Thank you. Let's get started. We got a lot of things to accomplish and not a lot of time, so I don't want to be coy about giving you this information. Here is what someone sent me.
Black America 400. Lucius Anderson wore a star as the Deep South's first black one of these in a century. Kristen.
What is a sheriff?
Sheriff, you got it.
Let's go back to the circus.
Anyone that has watched Jeopardy or has watched game shows know that people that participate in those type of competitions have to do a lot of just research and data and remember facts. It was so interesting that they found this particular factoid to express on Jeopardy about my father, which really embodies that as being a true American story. But I have to tell you, in order to be a true American, you have to start with resilience. And I want to just share with you the definition of resilience: the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties and toughness. I hope that I do justice in sharing with you about the type of resilience of my father and what he had to deal with during his time as sheriff in Macon County. Everyone that's in this room tonight has demonstrated resilience. That's why you're here right now. You don't realize it or not. Dealing with difficulties in your family, going to school, your first job, your first difficult experience in life, you had to deal with that with some type of resilience. And that's an important part of the character of who you are. Next slide. Lucius Anderson was born October 7th, 1933 in Bowling G, Alabama. Enlisted in the Army as a light weapons infantryman at the age of 18 in 1951. In fact, my father was too young to go into the military, and he had to have his mother's permission to sign for him to go into the military. But he, along with his other 3 older brothers, had each gone into the military at the age of 17 because, quite frankly, living on the farm did not appeal to them in 1955. Following period of Reconstruction and sharecropping, there was a lot of agriculture industry going on in the South. People had large farms, cotton, sweet potato, peanuts, all of those agriculture products. The family had to work the farms. And I think my father and his brothers were, quite frankly, finished with working on the farm. So initially when he enlisted, he went off to basic training, and they deployed him to Korea, because at that time we were in the Korean conflict between the United States and North Korea. And afterward, he served in Germany, and then later on at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and eventually as a drill sergeant in South Carolina. So I just want to share with you, to be a 17-year-old adult in the Army during conflict. Now, if anybody is a historian in here, and I got a couple of them in here, military historians, they can tell you that the Korean conflict was probably one of the worst wars America has been in. The climate, just the manpower of the enemy we was fighting, bullets flying everywhere, people dying. You had to have a lot of resilience to deal with that as an 18-year-old adult at that time. And these were the circumstances my father and a lot of other young males that joined the military faced at that time period. He was honorably discharged in 1959 at the rank of Sergeant First Class. He enrolled immediately as a student at Tuskegee University, formerly called Tuskegee Institute. 95% of the African-American GIs that signed up to go into the military automatically signed up for the GI Bill. GI Bill was a robust component of attracting people to join the military, and it was also used after the military so individuals could further their education. He married my mother, Wendora Erling Smith, December 22nd, 1963, 3 sons, my oldest brother, myself, and my brother Peter. Interesting story, my father and my mother met each other while he was employed part-time at the VA, and she was a nurse there, the VA hospital in Tuskegee, Alabama. And I guess over a period of time, they had been flirting with one another back and forth, and I mean, I'm here today, so obviously. Me too. Yes, you too, Peter. So this kind of lays the fabric of this person that left the farm for a better life, went into the military, faced extreme circumstances serving abroad to better himself, signed up to go to college, and now he's met someone he's ready to actually start his life. He was elected sheriff of Macon County on May 31st, 1966, and I want you to remember that date. He retired January 15th, 1987 after serving 20 years, and he passed away in 1994. Next slide. In order for me to break this down as to why my father was elected, I have to take a perspective as to what was going on in the country at that time. If you take a look up at the far left corner, you see a picture of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a young African-American boy who was brutally murdered in Money, Mississippi in 1955. And this affected the morality of the United States severely. His mother, in fact, asked that his casket remain open so people could see the disfigurement that had happened to her son after being murdered by individuals because he simply whistled or spoke to someone who he was not supposed to. That was like, for example, everyone today that's mourning the death of Kobe Bryant, that was a Kobe Bryant event of that time in 1955. People were actually scared for their children now. It was like, if they will do this to children, there's no telling what they will do to you. And then in concert with that, we have this energy that's going on in the South because in the 1950s, of course, the changing of the presidential administration from President Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, all of those things started creating this energy for voter turnout, which kind of coincided with the passage of the Voter Rights Act in 1965, August 5th to be exact. So all of these circumstances are going on. And then on top of that, you have Macon County, Alabama, which is the largest predominantly county in the state that is predominantly African-American. And it's also the home of Tuskegee University, has a population that's predominantly 88% African-American. That had a huge factor in why my father was able to get elected. And then last but not least, I have to put this in the local context. The citizens of Macon County, particularly Tuskegee, were very upset by the brutal murder of an individual called Sammy Young. Sammy Young was a student activist that was campaigning for nonviolent change on the campus of Tuskegee Institute at the time. He challenged the Public Accommodations Act by attempting to use a restroom at a gas station and was shot, killed by an individual who was later acquitted. This caused a lot of disharmony in the community of Macon County and Tuskegee. Disharmony to the point where there was a local Confederate statue that was tarred and feathered as a sign of anger by the students for his brutal murder, and obviously the community being upset with the acquittal of the individual who actually killed him. So all of these things together kind of contribute to, I think, my father being at the right place at the right time. People were fed up. They wanted to have a voice for them in law enforcement. Next slide. The day my father got sworn in, it was a challenge because at the time, the probate judge who had previously served as sheriff before, he felt like, in his own words, they never had all this much attention when I got reelected, so why are they doing all of these things special for sheriff now? So the swearing-in ceremony was closed to the public. Only people that were attendants were his deputies, Lee Ivory, John Merriweather, and Chief Deputy Arthur Knowles. This was his first staff in there, pictured above. Coincidentally, with my father's election, it was not well received by the former sheriff, and the former sheriff let it be known because when they handed over the keys to the jail facility, none of the keys worked to the jails. So he had to, my father, being resilient as he was, he just said, well, we just got to put a purchase order and get a locksmith in here and change all the locks. But that was just an example of the cooperation that was missing in that transition between my father and the social factors going on in Alabama at the time. Alabama Governor George Wallace, as well known in history, was not very friendly towards African Americans having position of authority in his state. And most people don't realize that George Wallace was elected twice, and because of state statutes, he couldn't run a third time, so guess who he ran? His wife. To continue. Lurleen Wallace served as the governor of Alabama, and she continued some of those Jim Crow practices that Governor Wallace had done. And one in particular he did to deal with this new sheriff in Macon County was to identify constables. Constables were individuals who could be appointed by the government who could go and could collect licensing fees for people needing gun permits. This was a revenue stream that my father had depended on, and the governor had inadvertently done things to cut off that funding source for him to take his authority. And considering that was a real issue because at the time, the salary for the sheriff was not that much, considering the fact that my father had a growing family, he had a wife to support, he had a home to support, and the compensation was a bit of a challenge for him, but he did it because this is what he wanted to do. There were challenges, yes they were, and did they come immediately? Not immediately, but they did come. There was a lot of challenge to how is this person now going to react to a real situation? Is he going to actually arrest a white person? Is that something that the community could stand? Because this is, although it was a predominantly African-American county, it still had a secondary component of the community, and they had a voice. And it happened to be one occasion where two law enforcement officers in a neighboring city had decided that there was an individual who had been described as being publicly drunk. He was arrested, he was beaten, and he was in fact told to dance as the law enforcement officer fired shots at his feet. And this individual contacted my father afterward and said, I want to file a complaint because I've been abused and such what. And my father didn't waste a minute and didn't hesitate at all in going down and arresting these two individuals. Now, I imagine it had to be pretty embarrassing for two white law enforcement officers to be arrested by a black sheriff. I imagine when they got together around the fishing hole and chewing the cud as we talk in the country, those guys were probably ribbed on quite a bit for that. One of the things that impacted my father's life significantly was the support he received after these demonstrations. He had shown the community of his ability to enforce the law fairly. One night there was a police chase that happened in Macon County, and my father was on duty, and it would involve some inmates who had escaped from a local correctional facility and were driving a car through Macon County. There was a high-speed pursuit that took place along a winding country road, and as a result, there was a major accident. One accident involved my father's car being run off the road and it catching on fire. He received third-degree burns and a broken hip, and the .357 revolver that you see outside on display was recovered from the wreckage as the only item that was salvageable. So that tells you how hot that fire had to be. Incidentally, while my father was recovering from this accident, he in fact won re-election. He didn't even have to campaign, not one day. He won re-election from his hospital bed. So that told you a lot about the community and the respect they had for him. We okay on time, Thomas? Okay, thank you. You're so nice. Next slide. I can't tell this story about my father without talking about me, because if it was not for my mother, I wouldn't be here today. My mother was a nurse who graduated from Tuskegee University eventually, and she loved people, just like my father. When my father became sheriff, she became a Head Start nurse supporting the children in Macon County. If anyone remembers, the Head Start program was a government program that emphasized nutrition, medical treatment. You had a school nurse come by, give you the lunches. She was the county representative for that. And she drove around to all of these people's houses, giving them school supplies, food, nutrition, fruit. This was something that she was really, really passionate about. And in the meantime, Dad, this is a point in time when right before the election, they were almost finished campaigning, and they were very optimistic about their future. There was a lot of media attention they were receiving, and they were really excited about the future. You can see it on their face now. And as you can see in here, my father, eventually, he did go back and finish his college degree, which he wanted to do in the beginning, which is why he signed the GI Bill, and he finished with a bachelor in political science. He later went on to get a law degree. And my mother, she as well finished with a Bachelor of Science in Nursing. And that young man with all that hair on his head over there, a long time ago, that person was me. And I myself am a graduate of Tuskegee University, and there are many Tuskegee University graduates in this audience tonight. Next slide. This is what people remember about Sheriff Amerson. He was sheriff for 20 years. He carried this big gun around. Yes, he did like a big gun. He used it, and he had this kind of charismatic flavor about himself. He wore these Stetson hats and cowboy boots, Austrian cowboy boots. So he had taken the role of a law enforcement, traditional law enforcement role, and kind of upscaled it with a little fashion, a little couple of accessories. And his election drew so much media attention, it also drew the attention from Hollywood. He was approached by a gentleman who was a producer and a writer from Hollywood, and they had conversations about his story. And eventually they started exchanging conversations to the point where they said, look, we'd like to use your story, and we asked you to sign over a letter of disclosure giving rights to it. And of course, Dad didn't understand all the implications of that, but shortly thereafter, a movie came out called Tick, 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 released in 1970. It was actually one of the few roles Jim Brown received critical acclaim for his acting, portraying a black sheriff in a rural white town in the 1960s. Same individual, same story, it's just that the person who the story was attached to was actually missing, who was my father. In fact, Dad had become more or less like a folklore around the end of his time in office. They had penned songs after him, and everyone had this old common saying, here comes Sheriff Amerson, and I'm going to tell Sheriff Amerson this and that. Those are the things I remember a lot about my father's interaction with the community. A couple of years ago, myself and some other people with a lot of help were able to pull together my father's life story, autobiography, Great Courage. It's available on Amazon's Kindle and Apple's iBook catalog platforms, electronic platforms, so you can download that book if you want to. And if you want to know more stories about Tuskegee and about the history, get a copy of that book, because not only did we talk about my father's life, but we talked about what was going on in the country at that time. And that's an important history component that we need to share with everyone as well. Next slide. So what have I been doing? to kind of continue to promote my dad's legacy because I'm very, very passionate about it, because it's a story that I think a lot of people connect with. So, of course, on the left, with the help of a lot of great folks, we got his autobiography published. We printed about 3,000 copies, and we sold about 3,000 copies to the point where we said it's probably more effective to just use ebooks since everyone downloads things now. So it's now available on the ebook platform. And then came the great opportunity to meet the former director of the museum, Mr. Craig Floyd, who I went into his office one day with a catalog that had outlined all of these stories and history about my father. And he said, "I love it." And from there started the relationship that we have to this day, and a relationship we want to continue to have, promoting his role in history and also sharing with others about the impact people of color can make in the law enforcement community. So this movie, let's come back to this movie. How do we get that energy going back for the movie? That's a good question. We're looking and we're interested in getting this made into a feature film. Why? Because it's a story that needs to be told, and why? Because it's a story people will watch. Ironically, $1.2 billion was made out of the Black Panther movie, and that was released worldwide. People sometimes ask me, do you think a story about a black sheriff would sell? I think it will. It's got all the components. A little action, a little car chase, a little fighting, a little assistance, love, compassion, all the great makings for a story, and we're actively looking for partners to continue to advance this story into a feature film. I'd like to take an opportunity to just kind of share you a picture, and here, let me let you hear Sheriff Amerson's voice himself. Next slide.
Small events sometimes mirror major change, and one of the biggest symbols of changing racial patterns in the American South will occur in the middle of January here in Tuskegee, Alabama, when a man named Lucius Anderson mounts these steps and enters the office of sheriff, becoming thereby the first Negro to be elected sheriff this century and the only Negro sheriff in the United States. What kind of sheriff do you think he'll make?
A damn poor one.
Why is that?
What does he know about law enforcement? Does he know anything? I don't know if he does.
You think it's a bad thing for the county for him to be elected?
Yes, sir.
Why is that?
Because we have never had a nigger sheriff here before, and the niggers won't respect him, even if the white people do.
I want to take this time and introduce you to tonight's distinguished guests. Please give a small round of applause for each member as I introduce them. Reverend Thomas L. Bolton. Reverend Bolton is often called DC's pastor. He is the Earl Harrison Minister of Social Justice at Shiloh Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. Reverend Bowen was previously Director of Community and Public Relations at IR Plus Media and Senior Religious Advocate with the Children's Defense Fund. Sheriff Paula Dance. Sheriff Dance is the first African-American woman sheriff in the state of North Carolina, where she serves in Pitt County. With nearly 30 years in law enforcement, Sheriff Dance spearheaded several initiatives to benefit Pitt County residents during her first year in office, including Sheriff's Heroin Addiction Recovery Program, or SHARP as it is called, abbreviation, and Women's Empowerment Addiction Recovery, or WARE programs. Frank Lee, Mr. Frank Lee. Frank Lee is the director of the Emergency Management Agency within the Department of Homeland Security in Macon County, Alabama. Mr. Lee has a strong background in community and social services. He's not only an emergency management expert, but also mitigation analyst and post-disaster coordination, as well as federal and state liaison. He holds an ME from Tuskegee University. Captain Sonia Pruitt. Captain Pruitt is with Montgomery County, Maryland's Police Department. Last June, she was recognized by the Montgomery County Council as the first black woman in the county to achieve the rank of captain in the county's police department. Captain Pruitt is also chairperson of the National Black Association and past president of the Coalition of Black Police Officers in Montgomery County. Thank you and welcome tonight. Let's kick this panel discussion off with some lively subjects for our panel members. I'd like to start with Sheriff Dance, if you will. The story of law enforcement for many years has been his story, a mostly male experience. Are there insights you might share that speak to the female experience as a deputy or commander?
Good question. Yes. The insights that I would share is that, normally or historically in law enforcement, women are usually pushed towards positions that entail doing duties like juvenile services or school resource officers or things that kind of gets us out of the way. But those are things that we can build upon because you always want that experience as well. So, I knew as I was going to run for sheriff, I was telling somebody earlier that I was talking with, I was the most qualified person that could run that office. And so I knew that it was time for us to kind of jump out and show that we can also be leaders as well, even after becoming school resource officers or all of those positions that women were pushed towards. So it's not easy. I tell people all the time that, you can't be one of the boys that generally you will find women trying to do so that they can be successful. You have to be who you are and embrace the skills that you have in law enforcement and what you've done and kind of expand off from those skills and experiences. So, right now I think that we women, there are a lot of women now that have become leaders. In North Carolina, there are 5 female chiefs that are probably a few more than that, but of the major cities. So we've changed the face of law enforcement, and that's what we had to do, was to change that face. And so I'm excited to be in a role that will create a path for other women to follow.
I realize that our panel members are balanced, so I must give the floor to this Captain Pruitt from Montgomery County Police Department to give her reflections on the same question.
Thank you. So I'm indulge me for a second. I just want to brag because Sheriff Dance is my cousin, and so. Can you all hear me? Okay. Okay. So I'm really proud of her, and my mother has threatened both of us that if we don't show up at the family reunion, there's going to be some repercussions. So I am a captain, as you introduced me, the first African-American female captain in my police department in Montgomery County, Maryland. My chief is here, Chief Marcus Jones. So I have some mentors in the room. Ron Davis, National Black Police Association, of which I am the chairperson now. And so what I would say after saying all of that is that you have to, as a black woman in law enforcement, there are some things you have to do. You have to find some mentors. You have to, and they don't necessarily have to look like you or be the same gender. Okay, just somebody who has your best interest at heart and who wants to help you learn, which is what I had to do. I will not lie, and the chief knows it was pretty difficult for me. I'm very outspoken. I grew up in North Carolina in a small town, but my grandmother was Medea. And so, she believed in righteousness. She believed in taking care of her community, and she would take care of anybody. She did not care what color you were, and in particular, if you were dealing with something like domestic violence. We had a house full of women that she was protecting because nobody wanted to fight her. And that's the kind of background I came from. And then I came here, and I'm sorry I didn't go to Tuskegee, but I'm a Howard girl. And so there, my knowledge of my history was solidified. And so I understand what racism really is. I know what it looks like. My father was a police officer, so I also have that legacy. And so I understood very early on how race and law enforcement intersect. But the challenge then is, what do you do with that information? I decided that I was always going to be truthful and that I would serve everyone equally and serve everyone with respect and treat them with dignity. And I say that, and it's not that easy, not because of my heart, but because law enforcement has a particular culture. By the way, I love being a police officer. It's one of the best decisions I've ever made. But we have some things that we need to work on as as law enforcement. We have to work on what the community thinks. We were founded on principles that said the community is in charge and you have to listen to what it is that they want. And so all of these things for me have culminated in a lot of challenges, but I think that I worked through them well. As a black woman, you have to be very persistent as well. And just keep your eye on the prize and what it is that you really, really want to do, what your truths are, and the service piece is paramount.
Thank you so much. I want to take this opportunity to have Reverend Bowen kind of talk about the challenges that the community face with dealing with law enforcement.
Well, thank you. I think first it's important to recognize that everyone's experience is different. But there are, for some individuals in our society, experiences that are the same. And a person's first encounter with law enforcement will linger with them for the remainder of their lives. And so that first encounter will dictate their view and perspective going forward. And so I think as we look at these historic figures seated in front of us, I know that they have a huge burden to carry, that they have the false choice, or are you black or are you blue? That people oftentimes will question them and their motives. That's why it's important, and that people who serve in law enforcement and can be their authentic self, so that people in the community can see themselves in law enforcement. I come from a small town, Leary, Ohio, about 25 miles west of Cleveland. We had our first police officer, I have to call his name, Officer Peoples, who was assigned in August of 1975. A few years after that, they had a riot in the community. But growing up, there was one black officer in my town. Now, my dad came up from Arkansas. And a lot of black parents have to get their children to talk. Well, my father's talk went something like this: if you get locked up, don't call me. I'll know where you are. They're going to feed you. They're going to house you. It's going to save me some money. Now, having heard that, I didn't think or know whether or not he was rooting for me to get locked up, or he was trying to instill something in my heart, but I believed him when he said it. I paused there because sometimes within the black community, we get into these discussions about the politics of respectability, that if persons in the community were to act a certain way, then things would not happen. Well, Emmett Till was wearing a suit when folk went to the house eventually to arrest him on that false accusation. But I have to say that overall, it's been important. It's been a great thing for people in the African-American community to see themselves in a uniform. Now, I'm from the black church, and it's a wonderful thing that in the black church you see officers on a Sunday morning. That at Shiloh Baptist Church here in D.C., where I serve, we have folk in our congregation who work as FBI agents, as Secret Service. I learned when President Obama came to visit the church that one of our members was actually a Secret Service agent assigned on that day. We have people who work in homicide. We have folk who walk on the beat. And my relationship with them has improved my outlook overall. that seeing yourselves and your interaction. Once again, it's not the case for everyone, because the last thing you want to tell someone who has perhaps been a victim is, well, it's not as bad as it used to be. You have to meet them where they are. And I believe we have to be progressive, that it was not the goal. It does not end here, that we all, as we reflect during Black History Month, must become enlisted and involved in the unfinished work of the civil rights movement. It begins with seeing ourselves in a uniform and sheriff and police chiefs, but we have to go from that perspective. And Jesse Jackson would often say, if you don't like something, you have an opportunity to change it, which is a wonderful thing that here in Washington, D.C., we have a cadet academy, which encourages young people in our community to aspire to careers in law enforcement and to help them to enroll not at Tuskegee or Howard or even at Morehouse, but at UDC, where they can get an education that prepares them to take exam and enroll. So all that to say, it's difficult. It's difficult to talk about law enforcement as it relates to the African American community, but it's not impossible that we have to engage. We know the community has changed. And I think it's funny how people want police officers to know folk in the community and they not know their own neighbors. That it takes all of us working together. It takes all of us working together. It takes all of us working together to bring about a more beloved society.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Reverend Bolton. I'd like to bounce over to Frank. You mentioned something, Reverend Bolton, about being your authentic self. And Frank, I want to allow you the opportunity just to share with people about Sheriff Amerson's authentic self.
Well, Sheriff Amerson was a very authentic person. Coming from Bowler, Alabama, and West Alabama, the Black Belt, he experienced the discrimination of blacks at an early age. Although he was the highest law enforcement officer in Macon County, he never lost his common touch. He had the ability to deal with kings and queens and doctors, lawyers, and also the guy on the street. I heard Commissioner Berry saying earlier, if you wore overalls or you wore a suit, he could relate. The whole sense of community policing was in effect in Macon County because he knew everyone. Whereas nowadays, police officers and sheriff's deputies, they meet people who they're unfamiliar with. Sheriff Amerson was a person that knew his beat. He knew his constituents. He understood what they went through because he had experienced some of those same difficulties. Very authentic, and I think that was the reason he was so successful, because he was always grounded, and he always was calm and cool and collective.
Thank you so much. I'd like to go back to Captain Pruitt, because since you have your cousin here, I can work you both together. Tell me about how do we change the views within the community about being receptive to law enforcement, receptive to law enforcement being in the community, receptive to partnering with law enforcement in the community. How do we change the views?
It's a great challenge. I think that our police department, I'm going to brag about my police department right now just a little bit. We do a great job of it because we've learned that part of the formula is taking the first step and building relationships with not just individuals in the community, not with just community groups, but also building partnerships with our county government partners and departments, and we all are using each other, as I use a law enforcement term, force multipliers in terms of community engagement. But I think law enforcement as a whole, we have this, I was talking about this yesterday, we can talk all day about what the issues are in law enforcement. We, as black officers, know what our issues are in law enforcement. We talk about it with one another and, our difficulties, and we share those things with one another because, you got to have somebody to lean on that understands. But until someone's willing to actually put action behind what we know the issues are, we're going to be just treading water. We got to acknowledge that race is an issue. race is an issue in the country, so why would it not be an issue in law enforcement? But what do we do when we find ourselves, we have an encounter and it's uncomfortable. Everybody's uncomfortable. The person who feels like they've been mistreated is uncomfortable. The officer is uncomfortable. So what do you do about that? And the only thing that I can think of, which has worked for me, and then sometimes it doesn't work, it's worked for me to be honest, to be okay with stepping out there and having this really difficult interaction, this really difficult conversation with someone in the community, with my coworkers, challenging something that I might see at work that I don't think is fair. You have to do that. I mean, it's just the right thing to do, right? But on the other end of that, there's some consequences. So then you have to be willing to accept those consequences. I mean, it took me 27 years to make captain. I honestly do not believe it was because I was not capable. It wasn't because of my skill set, which is tremendous. It wasn't because of my long resume or my education. I had all of those things in place. So it had to be something else. It wasn't because I was cursing my coworkers out. It was because, I had some incidents early on that made me stand apart from what the actual culture is. And so I invite anyone who is in law enforcement, and especially our community members, because you all drive, those of you who are not law enforcement, drive what we do. And you should hold us accountable and tell us what it is that you want to see, because we work for the community, right? We work for the public. But on the law enforcement end, we got to stop playing like these things are not happening, that they're not happening in the community, and that they're not happening within our police departments.
Thank you. That was a great point. I want to kind of throw a lob pass over to Sheriff Dance, because Captain Pruitt talked about the importance of having honest conversations. And Sheriff Dance, I want to just have you tell everybody a little bit about these honest conversations that led to you having to set up your heroin addiction recovery program and your women's empowerment addiction recovery program. Tell us a little bit about where that came from.
So as I ran for sheriff, some of the things that I talked about was the fact that we have continued to fight the war on drugs for so many years that I can't even recall when it was started. And we're not winning it. And so I thought, well, let's come at this from another perspective. Let's look at why people come into the detention center in the first place. And my thought process led me to three main reasons: substance use abuse, poverty, and mental illness. For the most part, those are the three reasons why people continue to come back and forth through those revolving doors of recidivism. And I wanted to address those issues. And so I started several programs, and one of them was the short program that deals with the male population, because most of the times that's who is in our jail, are men. Probably now I have 460 men sitting in our detention center. So I wanted to go with that population first and address issues of substance use. And I would bring in people who are peer-to-peer support people. I rely on my spiritual community. I had to rely heavily on grants because the county was not going to give me money for it. And even when starting it, I had some people in the county that was saying, we don't want our taxpayers going towards recovery. They ought not to have been on drugs anyway. And what they don't understand is this: your tax money pays $80 a day to take care of an inmate. When you think about feeding them, clothing them, giving them their basic human needs, why would you not want to have a healthy community by having people off from drugs? Secondarily, on the poverty side of it, I have now partnered with Pitt Community College, which is a local community college there in my town, who now comes in, assesses those who don't have GEDs or connect them with vocational skills so that they have the skill set to get a job. We have employers that are dying for employees who come in with those skill sets to work. You know, you think about teachers go to college for 4 years, but you can go through HVAC or get a certificate in heating and air and can make probably triple times what a 4-year degree teacher can make. So I wanted to address those issues in dealing with those who were coming in our detention center. And then I remembered I have a population of women that I wasn't doing anything with. And I know that women, most of the time, who come into our detention center or commit crimes, do so because of a trauma-based issue in their lives. And I did not want to miss that population. You know, there were women in that detention center that doesn't know how to do a budget, don't know how to write a check, don't know how to fold clothes, don't know how to cook, because they sometimes come from homes where they did not have anyone to teach them those things. And so I started a WARE program, or a program called WARE, which is Women's Empowerment Addiction Recovery as well, because a lot of them that come in, again, remember, this trauma-based. And with the $715,000 grant that I received, we were trying to connect those people with mental illnesses to resources on the outside, instead of just opening the door and letting them go and then there's just nothing. And so we're trying to connect those resources. And those are the ways from the back end of it that I'm coming from in trying to fight the war on drugs and poverty and mental illness. I give them those tools that they need while they're inside of the detention center, and I depend on my community for the resources to grab that rope when we open the door and pull them the rest of the way. So that's very important to me, and quite frankly, it affects people who look like me the most. And when something affects you personally, you're going to do more about it to make sure that we fix it and that we have a healthy community that is equitable to all.
Thank you so much. Reverend Bowen, I'd like you to share with us about some of the success that you have experienced with your Ministry of Social Justice at Shiloh Baptist Church. What are some of the needs and what are some success stories you can share with us?
Well, one of the things, and before I was social justice minister at Shiloh, I was the youth minister. And I would tell parents that bringing your child, your daughter, your son to church does not guarantee that they will not get in trouble. But if they get in trouble, they're better off knowing God than not knowing God. I tell our young people I want to come when you receive awards, but also want to be there when you're in trouble. And unfortunately, or fortunately, a few of them have taken me up on that. I've had to go to universities where some of our students were in trouble. I think to this day their parents don't even know. But we all know that it's important to have an advocate, someone to stand up for our young people. So a part of it is not just calling for some types of reform in our society, which we do because, like I said, we had the unfinished business of the civil rights movement, but we also have to be advocates for our children. And I thought about our children after the sheriff just spoke, that this is an auditorium full of young people. I would say at least 4 or 5 people would say, when I grow up, I want to be a sheriff. Because of what she just shared and the impact that she has had in her county. This is the beauty of it all. This is what it says. And there are some young people here, so we already have some folk here perhaps who want to go on to be sheriff based upon the witness and the testimony. Oftentimes, the black church historically has stood in the gap along with our civil rights organizations, NAACP, that when trouble happened in the community, they go to the church house, and a preacher would go down. When someone was locked up, the preacher would make his way, and the congregation be afraid of the preacher in his mouth, and they be outside making sure that the preacher didn't go off, way off. But social justice ministry in our church, we're advocates. Not for those who are perfect, God bless you if you are, but for those who have some bad days and some good days, but the calculus says that your good days outweigh your bad days. We want to be advocates for people. I've had to intervene when someone's child was pulled over another state and wound up in the hospital. Fortunately, I have friends in the legal profession, one who worked at Harvard Law School, who was able to offer some free legal advice. And so what we do as a church, and Pastor Jean is here from Martin Luther King Christian Church in Reston, Virginia. We do it all. That we go to the aid of our parishioners. We fight for reform. We try to influence the next generation. We have to walk with our people, our flock, wherever they walk. We have to be advocates in our community. And I said before that all our experiences are different. You know, not everyone can have, as I have, the cell number of the police chief. But we all, you'd be surprised, can get the phone number of the police officer that works in your community, and they are responsive. And we have to do a better job of taking the burden off our officers in some cases and building the relationships before certain incidents occur. We have to build the relationship now so that when things go wrong, if they do go wrong, then we know that we can see it through. We can have that difficult conversation. We can correct what needs to be corrected. But it's not just when situations occur, it's right now. By learning the story of those who wear the uniform. And then they're able to understand the stories of those in the community. And something that I did not mention was the fact that another important role, because we saw it when Sheriff Amerson was questioned by someone. What does he know about law enforcement? I don't know if he knows something, but what does he know? That there are officers perhaps, and they may have experienced this, who had never known the name of an African American before until they showed up on the force. And they become the emissaries, the ambassadors for the community, and change the outlook. So yes, we've come a long way, but we got a long way to go. And we have to share these stories, as difficult as they are, with our young people and point to a different direction.
Thank you so much. Frank, please join this conversation as your experience previously as the Macon County Commissioner, being able to see the type of needs and support in the community. Can you talk about the need for resources that a community needs at the county level to be effective in governing the law?
I certainly can, because at a very young age, I got a chance through the works of Sheriff Amerson and other law enforcement professionals. I was a high school yearbook photographer, and I took everybody's picture. I knew everybody. But one day they needed a crime scene photographer. They needed someone to do evidence photography. And I was that person, 18 years old. Can you imagine going to a crime scene, photographing all of that drama? And I guess I got an early start in understanding how important it was. I saw the inside track of a very difficult profession. I was on the other side of the camera. I was the eyes. I was the ears. Worked in radio, got a chance to see how these things happen. Nobody told me about it. I experienced it. I can tell you my first crime scene. I can tell you everything that happened. Those are the things that you don't see in the movies. You don't see them on TV shows. The drama, the trauma that law enforcement people go through. They're professionals. And when I got elected to the county commission at 28 years old in 1986, I knew firsthand because I had lived it. And I truly believe God put me there to give me the opportunity to make a difference and provide not only resources for law enforcement, but resources for all of our programs. But when you live it early and when you see it, it gives you the opportunity to know that you can start early, you can pay me now or pay me later. You can prevent programs that will raise young men or women, or you can send them to Sheriff Bronson's jail or Sheriff's Dance's jail and repair them or try to repair them as adults. So I saw it early, and it gave me an opportunity to put those resources where they needed to be put, and the dividend certainly will be beneficial in the end.
It's so wonderful. I'm hearing all the speakers talk about compassion, and we talk about how is compassion actually demonstrated, and that's caring for people. People that go into this line of work, my father as well, you have to be a compassionate person in order to take on this profession, because people will beat you down sometimes. It make life difficult, but still, there is a great sense of comfort in knowing that there are people there when you need them. And speaking of which, I want to be able to use this forum as an opportunity to discuss what issues we have in gaining trust in the African American community, bridging that gap with law enforcement and the African American community. What are the things that we need to in order to promote more trust? And I'd like to start with each panel member giving a one-word description of what they think is needed in order to build trust in the communities. And we'll start with Captain Pruitt. One word.
Relationships.
Frank?
Effective education.
Frank, that's more than one word, though.
Education.
Thank you.
Equality.
Hope.
So we hear all of these different topics that are very important components for supporting our law enforcement community. It's very important to support them in what they do. And another component of that is understanding that our law enforcement community need to be supported with stress management and the proper mental health support for them to do their jobs. There are people going out doing their jobs. Some of them are very young, some of them are very immature, being around people, and they're placed in circumstances where sometimes they make decisions that can change their life and others. How do we make these young, impressionable people able to be more calm and patient while not risk losing their life or someone else losing their life? How do we do that? I'd like to just kind of open that up for any panel member that wants to give comments. We don't need a manifesto, but we need to hear your ideas on how do we realistically address this.
Well, I'll start first. Can you all hear me? I'm not sure if this is on. It all starts at home. It has to be reinforced at home. I often say that the road to redemption for the relationship, to mend the relationship between our community and law enforcement, is a two-way street. Home has to do its part, and we have our part to do too, because we are not without fault. I've been in this business long enough to see some things, to know some things. And I know that we are not without fault, but at the same time, it's a two-way street. Home is not without fault either. I should not have to go out and tell parents how to tell their children how to interact with law enforcement. I shouldn't have to do that. I have 2 African American sons who are adults now. I have 3 children, but I'm focusing now on my sons because we know that that's where generally the issue is. I've had to have the talk with my sons. I've had to have that talk with my sons. I'm afraid for my sons. So I had that talk, and it was tough. And I didn't feel like I ought to have had that talk with my sons. So I know, being who I am and what I look like in law enforcement does not change anything when I'm out of this uniform. And I recognize that. So I'd say redemption, the road to redemption is a two-way street between our community and law enforcement, and we both have some work to do.
Thank you, thank you. And since I have been partnered with the museum, I want to share with you that they are focused on community outreach, bringing in students, having listening sessions, interacting with the community to identify some of the answers to some of those questions you have about how do we improve the relationship. So this museum is actually a great repository for support. Now, while we may not be the Smithsonians, we're still in a great location, have a lot of great services that we want to continue to let folks know that are available. Frank, we just want you to give your own personal experience as far as working with Sheriff Amerson. Any difficulties or challenges you saw him, and how did he handle it?
Well, you know, Sheriff Amerson had a very distinct way of doing things. He was a very respectable person in the community, and if he gave you his word was his bond. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. I can remember a story that was told to me by one of his earlier deputies. He went out to a rural area in Macon County and had an arrest warrant for a bootlegger, an illegal liquor maker, if you will, a moonshiner. And the gentleman told him, he said, "No end is going to arrest me." And the sheriff calmly said, "You can come in peace or come in pieces." And he did not raise his voice. He did not raise his voice. I talked to the gentleman's son daily. Commissioner Barry and he called us about 4 or 5 times on the way up here. But that is the way he governed himself. He didn't take any foolishness. And, you know, Commissioner Barry was one of his younger deputies, and he would go in the nightclubs on Friday night. They would do license checks. The deputies would go in. I mean, they would just ignore the deputies. But Sheriff Amerson would go in. They would have pool tables. They put the pool sticks on the wall, unplugged the rock hole, and stood at attention. He was a calm man with calm demeanor, but he said what he meant, and he meant what he said. And, you know, this whole moment to me is personal. It's overdue. It's delinquent. And I'm certainly proud, Anthony, to be a part of it. And your father was a great man.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you. Many people don't know that Frank Lee has been a strong advocate of documenting my father's contribution to Tuskegee and Macon County's legacy. In fact, we reconnected with each other about 2 years ago, and Frank has been carrying a photo of my dad on his computer because he wanted to actually see this event done. And I am so thankful to have a partner and an advocate for promoting this story to share with others. Thank you so much, Frank.
Well, we're halfway through, Anthony. We gotta do a better job at home, but we've done it from a national level. We're going to do the same thing locally. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. So at this time, did you want to comment?
I actually do. But
Please.
You asked us a question about health and wellness, which is near and dear to me. Officers across the country, or probably internationally, are suffering in so many ways that we don't know about. I mean, depression is that silent killer, and you add that the burdens of the job and the things that we absorb as first responders, and it's just at a crucial level. And so I'm invited. I know we have some law enforcement leaders in here, and I would like to invite my peers and other law enforcement leaders to really pay attention to what people are going through. People who suffer from chronic illnesses, which is one of the other things that I'm very sensitive about being a breast cancer survivor, is that besides the disease itself, there are the mental components and the emotional pieces. You might want to check in and see if people have support. Support is really, really important. It took my sons are here, by the way, and it took my sons to point out to me that I was acting differently, which then I was, I realized I was going through some depression after my chemotherapy. So please, if you have a member in your family who's in law enforcement and you are noticing some changes in their personalities, say something. Invite them to see a professional, because we don't want to lose anybody just because of the heaviness of what it is that we do. We want to help people. We want to be helped as well.
Reverend Bowen, did you want to add comments to that as well?
My comment has to do with Sheriff said about the talk. And I mentioned my father's talk that, I can still feel his breath on the back of my neck. But it's important because even the African proverb that says it takes a village to raise a child assumes that the village is healthy. So it starts at home, but our work picks up when people, children, are coming from places that they don't really identify or call home as we know it. And so we have to do, as a community, what we've always done, invite some of our children's friends to come in and, let them hear the talk as we give it to our children. That we have to perhaps volunteer more to be mentors in our community, to not be afraid of the children we see in the street, to speak a kind word to them. There's a video that we showed at Shiloh, and I recommend it to many. A brother out of Baltimore, I think, wrote it. Christian Theological Seminary in Indiana produced it along with Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago. It's called 10 Rules for Survival. Get home safely. Now, for some, they may think that it's criticizing the behavior of the young person. No, it's about things to think through. What every athlete does, right? Before they throw that game-winning touchdown, they've already rehearsed it in their mind. Well, 10 rules for survival, get home safely, is something I think that we ought to expose all of our young people to. It's meant to diffuse as many situations as humanly possible, and to make them not as nervous when they face certain encounters. You can get it on YouTube. It's still one of those things that's considered free in our society, but it's something that we ought to share broadly in our homes, in our communities, and in our places of worship.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll open up for questions and answers. As today, when we have so much social media influence on our children and their attention, I want to ask these panel members, how do we pull those children away so that we can stimulate them and nurture the next Sheriff Paula Dance, the next Captain Sonia Pruitt, the next Sheriff Andre Brunson, the next Sheriff Amerson? How do we do that?
Well, I think that kids today are attracted to social media. We need to use technology and display the kinds of accomplishments that these ladies and these men in this audience have been involved in. If they're attached to a media outlet, provide them positive things that will captivate their attentions to be like a Sheriff Dance and others. So I think we need to use the media to the best of our ability, use the tools that we have, modify those tools, and be able to attract young people through the use of a popular medium.
I agree with you 100%. I want to allow some of the other panel members to comment on the impact of social media and the attention that our children, our youth are tied to, and how can we redirect them to be so we can nurture the next group of law enforcement officials of color.
Ditto to what he said.
Okay, y'all making it hard for me. All right,
Okay, so I'm laughing because I'm looking at my sons like, y'all gonna give me the answer to this question or what? And they're like,
You know, I'm reminded of a story. This is a true story that happened in Macon County years ago, and I can say this, and I'm not being feminist about it, but there was a guy who was a frequent guy that got in trouble for drinking and driving. And when he saw this very beautiful law enforcement lady come in the establishment, he put his hands behind his back and said, "Arrest me, take me to jail." So what I'm saying is we need to use these positive female role models to attract other positive role models and do it. That's a true story. Now, I didn't make that up.
Frank, you know I love you. I'm not going to hang you out there on that one. We're going to let that one stay the way it is and just let it settle. Reverend Bowen, do you want to give some comments to that?
Well, I hesitate to respond because as a Baptist preacher, my plan was to take these stories and put them in my sermons as illustrations. But that's just it. That some of the stories that we've heard today are the stories that need to be out there on social media. You know, the story about the pieces. I mean, who would not, find humor and laughter in that? It's what Cornel West talks about, the tragic comic. It's what gives root to the blues, to be able to tell about the tragic aspects of our society, to look at them, to laugh, but ultimately to survive. To tell the story that for 30 minutes you were sheriff. I mean, it should not just be in this room. It should go outside of this room. So to create pieces that can go on social media and it can go on Instagram telling these stories of folk being sassy and speaking truth to power, even better being the power speaking truth. These are the things that can help change the imagination. Because I was shuddering just to hear these stories that took some boldness. For Sheriff Amerson to speak the way that he spoke, that his life was on the line, and yet there is, that they should not be considered outliers, and so therefore we have to tell these stories. So perhaps even before we have another release of a film, we can catalog these stories and scenes and then get them out there. I think it'll build interest, but it also just show how strong people have been over the years.
Thank you so much